Alright, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ready? Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. So today, inshallah ta'ala, will be the last class, the beliefs. Which means, this, alhamdulillah, I heard so that means people enjoyed the class. But also, there's a yay that you get an extra week to study. Yeah, you get one less exam, and you get one extra week to study for the final exam. Which means, in my inbox, there will be less complaints that I couldn't do the final exam because of this reason, and because of this reason. So this is what I'm looking for, inshallah ta'ala. So today will be the last class, and it might be a shorter class as well. So we're going to cover today, inshallah, what happened after the Prophet, peace be upon him. So after the Prophet, we're talking about beliefs. So everyone had this essential understanding of what Islam teaches. People had understanding of what Islam was, and during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they were trying to rectify their idolatry, rectify their other wrong beliefs that they had, and get it in alignment with Islam. So after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, there was no opportunity to go and consult him for any time a question would come up. So the people had to come up with answers for themselves, particularly for the scholars had to come up with those answers. So what happened was that there were several questions which arose in the Muslim community over time that started these discussions that they couldn't figure out exactly how they should answer these questions. So what happened was, whenever you had someone answering these questions, they would answer these questions in different ways. And we've seen some of them already. So whenever they would provide an answer, the group who answered the question this way, and the other group who answered the question in a different way, they started being called schools. Okay, or what's known as a madhab. Madhab means a place where you're approaching from, or where you're going from. Right? So the way in which you answered the question, or the methodology that you used to answer the question, was known as your school. So sometimes people would have a school, or you'd be labeled as having a school just in response to one question. You answered the question in one way, another person answered the question in another way, and therefore you say, well, you belong to the school of people who answered that question this way, and you belong to this other school, how they answered the question a different way. And sometimes what happened was that they kept on, these schools started resulting in people having more than one answer to more than one question. And that usually ended up being a school or a way of thinking, an ideology in terms of how you answer these kind of questions. So the thing is, when it comes to schools, a little note on the side is, every single field in which humans engage in has a school. Okay, what we call a madhab. So, for example, theology, which we're talking about, has a school. Islamic law, fiqh, they have different schools. Hanafi and Maliki school and Shafi'i school and all of that. Even Arabic grammar has different schools. There's the Basra school of way of thinking in grammar. There's a Kufan school, way of thinking in grammar. And before that, there were different tribes who had smaller minor schools. Banu Tamim had a different school and everything like that. Everyone had different schools. So you have schools in every single place where there is some room for human interpretation. Okay? So how many of you knew that there were actually schools or madhabs in grammar, for example? Okay, now you know, right? So you thought it's only oh no, this is these schools and these madhabs, we shouldn't have them, and they're dividing us, and they're a problem. This is a natural parcel of thinking. There are schools in interpreting the US Constitution. Does anyone know what the schools are? We studied them in high school. Democrats and Republicans are just two messed up groups. No. I'm talking about schools of thought. Those are like some other group. Yeah, strict constructionists and the loose constructionists, right? There's many schools, ways in which you're going to look at even the US Constitution as a document. Even though it's a human-produced document, still there are schools of thought. There are schools of thought in, victimology. There are schools of thought in psychology. There are schools of thought in sociology. There are schools of thought in philosophy. Every discipline which humans have some interpretive element there have schools of thought. Okay, so this is one part you have to understand. So it's there, okay? So it's a natural part of things. So the question is, where do you draw the lines? That's what everyone wants to know, right? Just tell me where to draw the lines so I could get this guy out, and I can get this guy in, and I should be in, and everyone else should be out. That's the main, that's where the controversy starts. But schools are natural. Okay, so what happens is that sometimes one issue which started to be debated resulted in a number of issues that were similar to it to be debated, and then those formed different schools in terms of how you answered the question. Okay, so we saw that. Among the early questions that arose right after the Prophet ﷺ, among somewhat after the Prophet ﷺ, was number one, who deserves to be the leader after the Prophet? This resulted in a school of thought, a way of thinking. Who should be the leader? Can it be anybody? Should it be someone from the Quraysh tribe? Should it be someone from the Ansar, the people of Medina? Should it be somebody from the family of the Prophet? Should it be the people who are controlling Mecca at the time? Who should be the successor or the leader after the Prophet, peace be upon him? So that's one question. And that results in different ways of thinking and answering that question. So that's a question in and of itself. Another question is, who is a reliable person from which I can get Islamic knowledge from? Meaning, who should I accept? So if somebody comes and tells me, I saw the Prophet doing this and this, and he said this and this, should you just take it from anyone? Are you allowed to? Should you take it from a non-Muslim? Should you take it from someone who now has accepted Islam, but when they heard it while they were not a Muslim yet at that time? Most people will say, no, not really. We're going to discuss that in another class. But this is a question, right? And the answer to the question is going to determine how you're thinking. Right? Do you just accept from any random person? Do you accept if a 7-year-old tells you now, when he's 30 years old, that when I was 7, I heard the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said this and this and this? Would you accept it from him? So I get no's and I get yeses. It depends on how smart he was or what? Okay, well, we're going to discuss it in another class as well. But the point is, you understand how there's questions, right? If some people say yes, some people say no, now what happens? Now you say, oh, well, you belong to the school that accepts the children relating hadith, and you belong to the other school that doesn't accept them. And the guy says, he's a sincere Muslim, he's 30 years old now. He's one of the most important Muslims in the community. So it doesn't matter, we're not going to accept what he heard when he was a little kid. It's not the same thing. And the other one says, no, we have to accept him, he's very clever, intelligent. We have to make an exception for this guy. So there's a different way of understanding things, okay? Another question, what happens to Muslims who commit major sins? And we saw this already, right? We saw it in this class? Yeah, we saw it in this class, right? We saw the group called Khawarij and all of that a little bit, or maybe in another class. What happens to them, right? So, someone who commits a major sin, right? It talks about in the Quran, whoever intentionally murders another Muslim, they're going to be in the hellfire forever. It's a verse in the Quran, right? Now, does that mean that no matter what they do, even if they repent or something, they killed somebody, they're going to be in hellfire forever? Or will their repentance, can it be accepted? So how you answer that question is going to result in a school of thought, a way of thinking, okay? And then we saw last week, how should the attributes of Allah, or the attributes which are referenced to Allah, which seem to compare Him to the creation, how should they be understood? So we saw the different schools last week when we talked about them. So what we're going to talk about today is, briefly, we're going to talk about the different major groups in early Islam, their origin, how they came about. And before I start that, let me give you a quick note. So a note is that there's one group of people that's going to say, we need these labels, and we need to use these labels on a regular basis to classify this person is Sunni, or this person is Shia, or this person is Ash'ari, or this person is among the Khawarij, or whatever it may be. We need these titles, we need these groups, so that we can know who's right and who's wrong, and we can relate with other people. And we should always keep these labels there. And there's another group of people that says, you know what? These labels and these titles and these groups are just going to divide us. Why can't we just call ourselves Muslims? Right? Let's all just be Muslims. Why do we have to have these groups, and why do we have to use these titles, and why do we have to have all these things? So the thing is this, when you understand what or where these groups come from, then you can determine in what context do you need to use a label, in which context do you not need to use a label. So for example, in the first context, when you're discussing with somebody, all right, and you go and you meet someone, and you say, Assalamu alaikum. So, oh, wa alaikum assalam. What's your name? Oh, my name is Muhammad. Oh, that's very good. So do you belong to that school of thought that accepts the children hadith, or do you not? Because I need to know, because whether or not we can, sit down, have a cup of tea together or something like that. The thing is, generally, you should always assume the best about the other person. Even if you don't agree with something or you think it's completely wrong, you don't need to insist that there's a title that this person needs to be described by initially. But now if a dispute breaks up, or somebody comes and says, hey, you know what? I would like to give a khutbah in your masjid. So, okay, well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So, my background doesn't matter. We're all Muslims. So you should allow me to just speak, and I have good credentials and this and that. It's not the same level. So when you are going to be working on a project, or you're going to be making a statement, or you're going to be doing something which is going to affect that other person's positions on some of these questions is going to affect you. Like for example, this person who says that Muslims who commit major sins, if they say they're going to hell forever, their repentance can never be accepted. And then someone says, hey, I would like to go give a lecture at your Friday family night, and I want to talk about the major sins. I want to talk about adultery and lying and everything to kind of get the community to realize that they need to stay away from these sins. Nothing's wrong with the topic, but what if that person starts going and just blasting his opinion, and you believe that this is a very, very problematic opinion, so much so that you cannot tolerate it, in the sense that you don't want your friends and your family to be hearing an opinion like this. Otherwise you have to go and try and correct it and stuff like that. Now the labeling makes a little bit more sense when somebody asks you, hey, why don't you invite that person? Or why don't you let him speak? There's nothing wrong. He's a Muslim and he's a this and he's a that, or whatever it is. And you say, well, because that person belongs to such and such group. And instead of explaining, because this person believes this about this issue and all of that, if the other person understands the label and you understand the label, and you said he happens to be among that school of thinking, among that label, then you use a label as a short way of describing what that person's thoughts or beliefs actually are. So hopefully that gives you a little bit context before we get into the groups, and then I'll remind you again, and we'll probably get a ton of questions about groups and labelings and all of that stuff. So just understand that from the beginning. So among the earliest groups that arose in history of Islam, the first was the Khawarij. Okay, the Khawarij were a group of soldiers in the army of Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the fourth Khalifa, when he was fighting Muawiyah. So he was fighting Muawiyah, and what happened was that the two of them, what's the name of the battle, by the way, those of you who are in the history class? Siffin. Alright, Battle of Camel was Aisha. Battle of Siffin. So in the Battle of Siffin, what happened was they came to an arbitration. They said, let's have arbitration between us, and let's stop fighting, and let's come to some conclusion about who's right and who's wrong, and what we should do to move the community forward. So what happened was, this group of people in the army of Ali had a major problem with his accepting arbitration. So they started saying that Ali has made a big mistake. He committed a major sin by agreeing to arbitration, which is leaving the word of Allah and going and taking the word of human beings. This is kind of where they started from. And then they accused him of being a disbeliever. So they said, anyone who was in the army and who didn't accept arbitration, they all became disbelievers. So they said, we also became disbelievers. So we have said our shahada again, we've accepted Islam one more time. And they went to Ali and they said, you have to accept that you were a disbeliever, and you need to go and accept Islam again in order to re-enter back into Islam properly. And Ali said, this is ridiculous what you guys are saying. This just doesn't even make any sense, So they left. And they left his army, which is where the word Khawarij comes from. So they left his group, they left his army, they left his way of thinking. They left the group and they went and they started their own little civilization somewhere else. Okay? So their main issue or their main point of belief was that any Muslim who commits a major sin is not a Muslim anymore. Okay? Any Muslim who commits a major sin, they're not Muslim, they've left Islam. So if you start drinking, okay, you start drinking alcohol, automatically you're not a Muslim anymore. You want to come back into Islam, you need to redeclare your Islam. All right? And that sin, if you die in that sin, in that state of sin, you're going straight to hell and you'll never be. There's nothing you can do about it. All right? Repentance, nothing's going to make a difference. Your belief is not going to make a difference, whatever it is. So that's a major sin. So this is one of their main points. So you have the group called the Khawarij. We said that. Then you have another group which arose in reaction to the Khawarij. So what you have to understand is when there was an issue that came up, one group arose and another group arose in reaction to it. So you have sometimes a reaction which is a harsh reaction. So another group came which are called the Murji'ah. So the Murji'ah, they responded to the belief of the Khawarij by saying that anyone who commits a major sin, that's not going to have any effect on the person's belief. So the Khawarij were saying, if you commit a major sin, your belief is nullified completely. You're not even a believer anymore. So the Murji'ah say, no, that's wrong. We have to, it's opposite. If you commit major sins, it doesn't affect your belief. Your belief stays intact. Your belief never can go away, no matter what you do. Okay, so they're a response and a reaction to the Khawarij. Now, a middle position between the two is what? Is that committing a major sin affects your faith. You don't become a disbeliever, but it has an effect on your piety or effect on your faith, so it has an effect on you. So this is something that happened in history. So you have these groups, and the only reason why I'm telling you about these groups is you will hear them sometimes in conversations and this and that, and it's important to know what their beliefs are, why they exist, and where to draw the lines of acceptability and all of that. Another group came up. They're known as the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila are known as rationalists. Okay, that's how Western authors call them. Known as rationalists. So where did they come up with? Where did they come from? There was a student of one of the scholars named Al-Hasan al-Basri. Guess where Hasan al-Basri lived? In Basra. Good. So Hasan al-Basri, he had a student by the name of Wasil ibn Ata, who died in the year 131 Hijri. So he used to teach, and he was teaching inside the masjid, and he had a study circle, and people were studying with him. And what happened was one day they got into a theological dispute about whether a sinner is a believer or a disbeliever. Right? So they were already discussing this idea because the Khawarij were well known. Hasan al-Basri knew about the Khawarij. He was talking about them, talking about the Murji'ah, this and that. So they were debating back and forth and discussing, is a believer, is a person who commits a major sin, is he a believer or disbeliever? Hasan al-Basri was saying, no, this person is still a believer. So Wasil got into an argument. He said, I don't agree with you. And he had some supporters in the classroom. So he said, no, you're wrong. And he proved his point. He tried to prove his point. And he said, the person is neither a believer nor a disbeliever. Instead, they're in a position between two states. Manzila baina manzilatain. He's in an intermediate state. So it's kind of like the Christians that came up with the idea of purgatory, this middle state between heaven and hell later on. So he came up with this other idea that the person who commits a sin is neither a believer nor a disbeliever, based upon his understanding. So he left. And Hasan al-Basri made a comment and he said, Wasil has withdrawn from us. From the word i'tazala, meaning he's left us. That's where the term Mu'tazila comes from. The people who left the study circle of Hasan al-Basri. Later on, now they didn't call themselves Mu'tazila, obviously. Don't think that the Khawarij called themselves the Khawarij. Right? Obviously, they're not going to. So you have to understand the different term. Mu'tazila are not going to call themselves the Mu'tazila. So they came up with a new term for themselves, and they called themselves Ahl al-Tawheed wal-Adl. The people of unity, Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and Adl, justice. Right? So their conception of justice was a very rationalistic conception. And when we say rationalistic, you have to understand what the word rational means, because for the average person, they use these terms very loosely. They say, oh, it is rational, or it's logical. Islam is logical and it makes sense. Islam is rational and it makes sense. When we say rational and logical, we're talking about something completely different. We're talking about the understanding of Greek philosophy, in particular, how to categorize things and how to use your mind to figure out certain aspects of revelation, and sometimes putting the intellect on top of the revelation, above and over the revelation, and discarding or modifying parts of it or something like that. So they were very influenced by Greek philosophy, because this was the time that all the Greek texts of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates were being translated into Arabic. In which region? Where did it start? Baghdad, right? In Iraq, right? Iraq region. So this all was being translated and everything like that. For them, they had a lot of respect for Greek philosophy, and they felt that they need to kind of reshape the way that Islam is presented into the Greek philosophy model, Aristotelian model particularly. That's something when it comes to the Mu'tazila. So some of their main beliefs. They believed, number one, that the Quran was created rather than uncreated. So this became a big dispute in history. I think we already talked about this, right, in this class? So they believed that the Quran was created rather than uncreated. They believe that believers who commit major sins will have eternal punishment. And they believe that major sins will lead a person to be in a state between belief and disbelief. These are just some of the things that they believe, but they believed a lot of other things as well. Okay? And they give a lot of figurative interpretations to a lot of different texts and everything. So now, in response to the Mu'tazila, you have three schools emerge. Okay, so you have to understand that how this is a response back to this is a response back to this. So, responding to the Khawarij were the Murji'ah. Now, responding to the Mu'tazila, you have three groups. Group number one, and we've already talked about them, last week. Group number one are the Atharis, or the textualists, right? The founder or the main figure was Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who came up, and he made the argument that Muslims should believe in the texts themselves when it comes to the attributes which are associated with Allah, and we should not say that they're metaphors, like hand of Allah and all of that. We should not say that they're metaphors, and we should just believe in them, and we should deny any association with creation of those things. He also is popular because he stood his ground during what's known as the Mu'tazilite Inquisition, where they went around questioning scholars, do you believe the Quran is created or uncreated? And anyone who said that the Quran is uncreated because they believe it's the word of Allah, they were tortured and put in prison. So Imam Ahmad, he stood his ground, and he got tortured, and he got put in prison. But he was known to be a hero of that time, because he said, you're not going to tell me how I'm going to understand these things. I'm going to understand it on my own way, and this is what I believe to be true. So he's pretty popular because of that. And this group of Atharis, they generally refer to themselves as Salafi when they talk about theology. Okay? So this does not mean that what you hear, the term Salafi, whenever you keep hearing it right there, it doesn't mean that this is the only way that this term has been used. This term has been used by extremely liberal, modernist people like Muhammad Abduh, for example, who said in his tafsir that, jinn are not real. Jinn are just microbes. And we couldn't see them before because we didn't have, microscope. And now we can see them, and that's what they refer to. And a lot of other things. So the term Salafi does not necessarily mean one thing in every context, but generally this group, they refer to themselves as Salafis when they're believing in this type of theology. Okay, and we talked about that last week, right? So Ash'aris is another group. So the Ash'aris are a reaction to the Mu'tazila and the Athari school, and they're trying to find a common ground in between the two of them. So you know what, let's try and find some balance in the middle somewhere. So a scholar by the name of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, he was the founder, and that's why it's called the Ash'ari school. And he was a Mu'tazilite. So he was a Mu'tazili scholar who one day or 1 month or something had a transformation, and he realized, we've taken it too far. This has just gone too far. There's too much philosophy. There's too much rationalism involved. This is going against the spirit of Islam. So we need to I need to rethink these things. So he went and he started thinking, and he started, coming down, discussing with other people, and he worked out all the weaknesses in the Mu'tazila school. And then he came up on the minbar. He stopped giving khutbah and everything. He came up and then he announced, he said, all of you know me to be one of the Mu'tazila, and now I am leaving them. Yeah, he's Mu'tazilizing from the Mu'tazila school. He's leaving the Mu'tazila school, and he's saying, I'm returning back to the what he considered to be the real beliefs of Islam. And he gave answers though. So he gave detailed answers to why the Mu'tazila were wrong, and he started debating with them, and he came up with another school or another way of explaining things. Since the Athari school said, we're not going to explain these things. He said, we're going to explain them, but we're not going to explain them the way the Mu'tazila are explaining them. Okay? So he abandoned this school, and then he dedicated his life to refuting their ideas. And then they developed their own methodology so that they could interpret, certain beliefs of Islam and give detailed proofs and all of that. Then you have another school which also came as a reaction to the Mu'tazila school. It's known as the Maturidi school. The Maturidi school was founded by Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, died in 333. He was the founder of the school. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. Right? And Maturida, as I mentioned before, is a place. Right? Otherwise in Arabic, ma means what, and turid means you want. It's like whatever you want. So the Maturidi school of thought is not the whatever you want school of thought. Okay, you can't just pick whatever you want. It's actually the name of a place. All right. So he's the founder of the school. It's actually quite similar to the Ash'ari school, with few disagreements over some points. Like, for example, can someone's belief, can it increase or decrease? Right? And we talked, and you understand why that's important now, because of the Khawarij and because the Murji'ah and what their position was regarding who's a believer and who's not a believer, and the Mu'tazila saying that there's two groups you're in a state in between and all of that. So you understand why this can, be an interesting issue. So they came and they started saying that somebody's faith belief does not increase or decrease. It's your piety that increases or decreases, but it's not your faith that will increase or decrease. So it's static. It stays in one place. So these are main theological schools of thought. Okay. Then we're going to move on to the Shia. So the Shia are literally known as the party of Ali. So Shia means like the group or the party or the supporters of somebody. So the Shia were the Shia of Ali, the people who supported Ali. So particularly their main belief in the beginning, early on, was that they believed that the family of the Prophet had the right to leadership after the Prophet. So this was their main understanding, and anyone at that time, they were not really labeled at that early period of time, but this was the main thing that started up. So what would this imply though? This could have the implication that Abu Bakr, that Umar, that Uthman, they usurped the right of leadership from Ali and they took it themselves. So now you start seeing where, okay, this can potentially be problematic. If you feel, so there's different ranges in every group. There's some people who are a little bit more hardcore in some opinions, some people are a little bit more accepting and welcoming. So in the same thing, with the Ash'aris it's the same thing, with the Atharis it's the same thing. So now with the Shia you have some range here. So you have some people who will say that Ali should have been the leader because he's more qualified and he's from the family of the Prophet. That's one way of understanding it. Then there are people at the end of the spectrum on this question and saying Ali was 100% declared to be the leader by the Prophet, and Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman, they stole that right from him. So you can see how this issue can fluctuate across boundaries. So if somebody says, well, on this issue, I believe that Ali should have been the Khalifa, you cannot determine from their statement where they are on this scale. Can you? You can't. You can't, because they could be on this side of the scale or they can be on this side of the scale. They could be one of the people who says, well, I think from my research and my understanding and what I know, I think Ali probably would have been more qualified than Umar, for example. They're on this side of the scale. But if somebody made the same statement, you can't say, you know what that means? The moment you make that statement, it means that you believe that Abu Bakr was a tyrant who stole the leadership and this and that. You can't infer that from the person's statement unless they're clarifying their statement and they're actually saying that. So you have to keep that in mind. So now, this is where part of this main thing started. Now, many of them, the vast majority of the Shia, they claim that the leaders who are supposed to be the leader, like Ali and his children and the people from the family of the Prophet, they are not only political leaders, like Abu Bakr was or Umar was. They are also spiritual leaders in the sense that they have the sole right to interpret and understand the Quran and the other teachings of Islam. So what they say is binding. Okay, somewhat like, kind of like the Pope to issue, edicts and, rulings and all of that. So this is another aspect of when we say leadership, do we mean political leadership or do we mean spiritual leadership as well? Spiritual leadership, we're talking spiritual leadership in the sense of absolute spiritual leadership. Like you have to go to this person, right? So this is something where, there was a split in the community in terms of understanding. So now you have three main groups. There's a lot of groups among Shia, but there's three main groups. Okay, and we're going to talk about the three groups today. We've already been covering them in history, at least two of them in history. So the first one are known as the Twelvers, or the Ithna Ashariya. Okay, Ithna Ashariya means 12. It's the number 12. So Ithna Ashariya means the Twelvers. The number 12 is Ithna Ashariya. So these people who are the vast majority of Shia in the world today, Iran and all of these different regions, they believe that Ali was the first Imam, spiritually as well as politically. And this leadership, right, passed down through his lineage. But what happened was the 12th Imam disappeared and when he was young and he went into hiding. Anyone remember what year it was? From history class. 12 Imams, imagine 11 kids coming down the generation. This is about 300, after 300 Hijri, right? So this is after Imam Bukhari, after Imam Muslim, after the hadith had been codified, after the four schools of thought had come in Sunni understanding, Imam Ahmad and Shafi'i school, Hanafi school. This is after all of that. So what happened was, he went into hiding and his advisors or his representatives used to go and communicate with him and deliver his communication. Now, why is it so important that he has representatives to deliver communication to his followers? Why is it so important? Yeah, he's the sole authority. Exactly. He's the sole authority. You have a question, you have to get the answer from this guy. He's the main person or someone who he's licensing or acknowledging, right? So he has to have a group of people who can go and communicate with him. They're going and communicating with him, and then all of a sudden when he's reaching about the age of like 60, 70, time is going on, you can't just keep on saying that, he's like an eternal person. He just keeps on living and you keep on communicating with him. So 60 years after he went into hiding, his emissaries came and said, he's gone into occultation, meaning a type of spiritual retreat in hiding, where he's not going to be coming back anymore until the end of time. When the end of the world is near, he's going to come back one day at the end and he's going to bring justice to the world. But right now he's in a state of hiding. So now a new form of how you get access to Islamic knowledge appeared among the group. And then you get ayatollahs and you get different groups, but these are not among the top 12 Imams. But they have somehow access to knowledge which is similar to like the 12 Imams. And then we're not going to get into the rest of the details. But you have to understand that's where this group comes from. So this is one offshoot of the Shia. The next group is the Zaydis. Okay? So the Zaydis, the main difference, there are two main differences. The first main difference is the vast majority of Zaydis who live in Yemen, by the way, they believe, the vast majority of them believe that Ali should have been the leader, because of his qualifications, not because somebody usurped the right from him or something along those lines. Okay? So they're one of those groups on this side of the spectrum. But one of their main differences between the other people was they believe that an imam, according to the imams that we're talking about, the definition of imam, an imam can only be someone who rose up and fought a rebellion against a political power, against a political authority. So for them, the imam is not so much of a spiritual figure who's supposed to be giving you the only interpretation of Islam and no one else is supposed to be doing it. For them, the imam was a purely political figure. And the only person who's defined as an imam is, one, they have to be from the family of the Prophet, and two, they should have risen up in revolt against the leadership. Otherwise, you're not a true imam. This is your responsibility. So the issue that they had was with the fifth imam of the 12 verse. The fifth imam was Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. And they say Imam Muhammad al-Baqir did not stage a rebellion against the prevailing authority of the time. Therefore, he is not a real imam. So he should not be viewed as proper, as the imam. And the chain kind of broke from there and they broke off into their own group around this time. So you understand some time frame. Imam al-Baqir. Okay. And then you have the Ismailis, which we've been covering in history. Right? So the Ismailis, they've been in power in history. We talked about they founded a very important university. Aga Khan University? A more important university. Al-Azhar University, yes. They founded, they were the Fatimids, and they controlled Egypt, they controlled parts of Syria, they were a very powerful force in the past. Although nowadays, they're the minority. Minority of the minority nowadays, in terms of how many there are throughout the world and everything. So they believe, among their main beliefs are that the seventh Imam, according to the 12 verse, the Ithna Ashari, they said that the seventh Imam, his elder brother Ismail, had died before his younger brother. And the Ismailis, they say, no, this Ismail, the elder brother, he was alive and he's the rightful Imam. And he should have been the Imam, so the followers flocked around this person. And they also had the idea of the spiritual imamate. So he's the true seventh Imam, and that's why they're also known as the Seveners. Because they believe the seventh Imam, Ismail, is the main guy. And the interesting thing about them is they believe in that the imamship or whatever, it continued on. And it kept on going and it still exists today. So they still have their living Imam who is not only a political authority, he's the spiritual absolute authority in everything. And he is known as, anyone know his name? Or his title? Aga Khan. What number? The fourth. It's in the notes, right? So Aga Khan the fourth. So he's alive today. Guess where he lives? He lives outside of Paris. That's right. So he lives in France, and he's a very, what's the right word? He's a very charitable person, because the Ismailis, they contribute a lot of money. They have tithing. So they have to give a certain percentage, like over 10%, I think it's 12 or 15% of their wealth every year to the organization, and then they go and they do charitable projects and everything like that. So some interesting things, the more you research about him, the more interesting things you find. He's well educated in Western universities. He has honorary degrees from Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Columbia, almost every single major university you can think of. Of course, he's also a sponsor, millions of dollars to all of those universities at the same time. And he owns one of the fastest yachts in existence. It's a $100 million yacht. So I just thought that was interesting. So there's a lot of interesting statistics about him online. You can look them up. So that's Ismailis. Now there's another group known as the Ahl Sunnah. Okay, now the Ahl Sunnah, linguistically, the word Sunnah means the prophetic way, or the way of the Prophet. So the Ahl Sunnah meaning the people or the followers of the Sunnah or the prophetic way. Okay, so what do they believe? They believe mainly that political leadership of the Muslim community was left open for the Muslims to decide when it comes to political leadership. So whatever the Muslims decide amongst themselves, for the most part, that's going to be the leader. And you just choose a good leader and choose a righteous person, you choose a knowledgeable person, and whatever the community accepts, that's going to be sufficient. And because of that, they agree that Abu Bakr was the first Khalifa, Umar was the second, Uthman was the third, Ali was the fourth, and they were all legitimate leaders in their own realm because they were elected and decided upon by the community. So they also believe that no one has a spiritual monopoly over interpreting the Quran or interpreting the Sunnah. Interpreting what the Prophet peace be upon him said, what he did, all of that. So no one has full 100% claim. No matter how pious they may appear or whatever it is, you just go to the people who have the most knowledge and who are the most pious, and you hope that, inshallah, Allah is going to guide you on the right path, and that's the way to go. And you look at the entire community, right? So this is one of their other beliefs. And they say the most righteous and knowledgeable people are the guides for others. Now, who's included in this group historically? Okay, historically, among this group, the looser interpretation, among the groups that we saw are the Atharis, the Ash'aris, the Maturidis. Who has generally been excluded from this group? The Khawarij, the Mu'tazila, and the Shia. Now, the question is why? All right, why were the Mu'tazila excluded from this group in terms of, literature and all that, when they were not really talking too much about who should be the leader? That was not one of their main points, right? Leadership. So why were they generally considered to be excluded? The reason is because this group of Muslims were also known to be the mainstream, or al-jama'ah. So what happens is they were generally the majority in most of the places which were, started out in Islam, and they were controlling and all of that. So they became known as the Ahl Sunnah and al-Jama'ah. The Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and that's the term that came about. The reason why they excluded the Mu'tazila or the rationalists is because their way of thinking and their way of understanding was a very elite, minority group of people who, the Mu'tazila mainly were the armchair intellectuals, the really highly educated people of the society, but very, what we call today, modernistic in their thinking or whatever. This is what the Mu'tazila were. They were very intellectual people, but at the same time, their way of thinking, their way of understanding things was different, as we've mentioned today and in previous classes. And also, the Khawarij were kind of, they were out of this group, particularly because the idea of Jama'ah. Khawarij said what? Well, we're out of here. We don't want to live with you. We don't want to be in your group. We don't want to be in your army. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go and do our own thing. So this is another reason why they were excluded. Okay, so these are just the general groups for the most part. Since we've covered most of the important issues that you need to learn and know, I was debating whether or not to even introduce these groups, but the reality is most people have encountered these groups at one point in time in their life. How many of you heard of at least 3 out of these groups before you came to this class? How about 5? You heard of 5 before you came. A vast majority, right? So that's why it's important to understand and know who these groups are, what they really stand for. Otherwise, you just get this, kind of half-baked, understanding of where they come from and what's going on and all of that. And hopefully that clarifies and gives you some understanding of what to do. So now let's pause and let's take questions on the material, course material. Yeah, so how the 12 Imams, when did the idea of 12 Imams come about? So according to the 12 verse, it's been there since the beginning, right? According to the 12 verse, during the time of the Prophet, it was already there. And there are some hadith which talk about 12 leaders are going to be coming. They're authentic hadith, even Sunnis accept them. So the 12ers will say this refers to these 12 Imams. The Ismailis don't accept this at all. They say, no, this is completely wrong. There's no such thing as a 12th Imam is going to go into hiding and all of that. They don't accept this. The Zaydis don't accept this either. And the Ahl Sunnah don't accept this either. So it depends on who you ask, right? So the majority of the other groups, they're going to say, no, this idea probably started either, most likely it started when the 12th Imam disappeared because he was too young and they needed to come up with some excuse. Or maybe some of the ideas were building up, maybe around the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th Imam, somewhere around there, but definitely not in the early period. So that's the thing. So Allah knows best when it originated. But I mean, an outside observer would probably say this originated when the 12th Imam disappeared the first time. So basically what probably happened was the 12th Imam died or he got killed or something, and there was no 13th Imam, and you say, well, what are you going to do? Now your whole belief and your whole philosophy is going to get messed up. You say, okay, let's say he's in hiding and see how long, we can, carry on, this idea. Or perhaps they thought he was actually alive somewhere and they were looking for him or whatever, and they didn't find him, then they came up with this idea. So Allah knows best exactly how it happened. Zaydis they don't believe in Aga Khan, it's Ismailis. Yeah, they believe that. They believe that he's like an incarnation of something or the other. Does anyone know an Aga Khani people, Ismaili people? You know them, so you can ask them. Or you can go visit, Paris, check out the Eiffel Tower, and go ask the Aga Khan yourself. And Imam, meaning like the Imam, who's the spiritual and political leader 100%, is still alive. And that's Aga Khan, the fourth version. Something like, I don't know the details of their belief, but they have this idea. No, all the Imams in the past, or you mean now? Yeah, no, they believe that all of them were the same status. Same time. I don't know the concept, to be honest, with the details of reincarnation, all of that, but there's some beliefs that they have about how this guy became like the man, right? So yeah, I don't know the details exactly. It means sinning believers for the Mu'tazila means that if you're committing major sins and you die in that state, even if you're a believer from the Sunni perspective, you're not a believer. So you're going to hell forever for committing major sins. I don't know the details of their belief. Probably some say once or consistently, or like this. Like they say, if you're drinking alcohol and you die in that state, you're going to hell and you're never going to be taken out ever. So you're finished. It doesn't matter if you just prayed prayer beforehand and you had the intention of making the next prayer. Yeah. So the thing is, that's what they're saying. So you're in a state, if you commit a major sin, you're neither a full disbeliever nor you're a believer. But in order for you to be in paradise, you have to be a full believer. Therefore, you can't go into paradise. Yeah, they're not the only one. That's it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the founders of the groups, a lot of people attribute it to Abdullah ibn Saba, one of the people who caused a lot of fitna and problems in the community. So it's likely that he played a role in a lot of these ideas. But because he's a figure who kind of worked under the scenes, you cannot 100% say that he's responsible for everything. Because anyone who's secretive, then you don't know exactly how much damage they've done 100% because they were secretive. That's the whole point. 12 verse, do they believe in Isa alayhi salam coming back? Do they? Yes, they do. Mahdi. So Imam Mahdi for them. Is there going to be the Imam? Okay. That's right. He's the 12th Imam. Imam Mahdi for them is the 12th Imam. And he's going to be back. So for them, they said the 12th Imam was the Mahdi when he went into hiding and he's going to come back. I don't know the details. I think most of them believe that he's still in some kind of spiritual state. So he's alive in some state and he's going to come back. The Khawarij now, okay, the Khawarij are not the Khawarij of the past, okay, in terms of their actions and killing people and all of that. So the Khawarij only exist in one country today, officially, and that's in Oman. And they're known as the Ibadis. Okay, so Ibadis are officially from the Khawarij way of thinking, but they're not violent people anymore. So they've changed their ways. But their mentality, their mindset is very similar, same kind of beliefs as the Khawarij of the past. Okay, so that's the thing. So the question is, are all of them believers or all of them Muslim? Okay, that's a very good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So the thing is, like I said, within each group, there's a range of different opinions, right? And they have additional opinions in addition to some of these core beliefs. So the question is, some of them, depending on which group and how extreme within the group they are, some of them believe that the Quran has not been preserved intact. They believe that part of the Quran is missing. If anyone believes that, then they're not a Muslim anymore. Some of them believe that their imams, whatever they say, it overrides whatever the Quran says. So anyone who believes something like that, they're not a Muslim anymore, because you've overridden what the Quran says. Right? So things like that, which are so, clear cut, like all the stuff we learned in the previous 7 classes, right? The first 7 classes, that was all to build up your foundation to determine this is what you need to know for sure, to make it very clear. And whenever someone comes up with something way out of there, then there's a major problem. Okay? Ahl Sunnah or Sunnis. It's just a short name for Ahl Sunnah. So we mentioned them, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis and all of that. So those are the main groups. And then the rest are like political movements, like Ikhwan al-Muslimin and Jamaat Islami and all of this. So there's different groups within Ahl Sunnah. Okay? Origins of Habashis. Okay, because they're a more modern group, we're going to leave them out. There's so many modern groups. One day, I'm hoping if we do a 3rd year of CIS or a 4th year of CIS, we're going to do a whole class on modern Islamic movements. Modern meaning like the last 500 years, Islamic movements throughout history. So I would like to do that. It's have a really good book, really good book on this, written by one of my teachers. But we need to first finish the 2 years of CIS. Okay. Imam Hassan al-Basri, he was with Ahl Sunnah opinion, which says anyone who commits a major sin is still a believer. Although it's sinful what they're doing, but they're still a believer. He told you himself? They told you themselves? Okay, so usually, from what I've been told, is that that's not a public opinion. That's usually the people who hold that belief, they don't say it publicly, they keep it private. But if they say it public, then yes. So the question was, she has some friends who are Shia, and they say that 10 chapters of the Quran were missing. So they openly say that. So, that's written in many books. There's many books of the Shia which say that in writing. But usually if you go and you ask a Shia imam or a Shia follower or something, they say, no, we don't really believe that. So you can't argue with someone who's denying it. But now that you're saying that they say it openly, this is a major problem. Major problem. Saying that, Quran is missing. All right? So somebody like that, you're not allowed to pray behind them. If you know that. But you can't make an analogy and you see somebody else and say, oh, well, this person must be the same as them. You can't always put everyone in the same group. So yeah, there's a lot of different groups and a lot of different people. So some people may believe it and not say it, and some people may not believe it. And some people believe it and say it. So you just need to be, cautious and careful. And there are books though. I've seen it myself. There are books that do say that. They do say that, yeah. Some major books. Yeah, and maybe not in the public, but when you study it in detail, there are quite a few books who do mention things like that. So you cannot judge everyone in the same grouping. Yeah, these are all, sects within the Shia groups, yes. They all have different beliefs. So the thing is, they have different beliefs. So the thing is, remember, there's Islamic beliefs, and then there's Islamic law. So some of them have major differences in beliefs and major differences in law. Some of them have minor differences in beliefs and major differences in law. The point of this was to not break down all the groups. That's the whole. It was just to give you a general overview, a kind of understand what happened after the Prophet ﷺ, just to give you an overview of what happened and how some of the groups came about, not to go into the details of the groups. A lot of people, when it comes to those extreme views, they deny that being attributed to them. Even if internally in their own group they say it, when you go and you talk to them, they'll deny it. They say, we don't say that. Because they know what you're going to think about that. All right? So this idea that Angel Jibril went to the wrong person, they're going to deny that. Most people will deny it. except maybe your friends, they trust you or something like that. They told you openly. Most of them deny it and they'll say no. So what are you going to do? You say, no, you do say that. And you say, no, I don't say that. No, you do. You can't sit there and argue and say, no, I know you believe this. Just tell me the truth. You give them a lie detector test or something. There's no need for that. Just say, okay, fine. If you don't believe that, fine. But if whoever does believe that, and they're really wrong, then you should leave it at that. There's no need to dispute more. No, there's no book I would recommend, unfortunately. The Shia-Sunni differences, what I would recommend are 2 books. One book is, read the book about like Shiism for Dummies. Right? That's one interesting book. Hopefully make sure it's written by a Shia. And then read another book by Maulana Manzoor Nomani. It's called Khomeini, Iranian Revolution, and the Shiite Faith. And compare the 2. That's what I would recommend for you. Khomeini, Iranian Revolution, and the Shiite Faith. By Manzoor Nomani. Where do Sufis fall? Sufis are just people who emphasize spirituality, and they have a huge range of different beliefs and everything. So they can fall anywhere. They can fall within Shia groups, they can fall within Sunni groups, they can fall within Khawarij groups, they can fall across the board. It's more like a focus on things, and then they've evolved their own ideas and everything. So mainly I wanted to talk about what major differences kind of arose in the early period. And later on, a lot of things came afterwards. Okay, so just talking about main stuff. Okay, so the whole thing about not praying behind someone because you believe that they're completely on wrong beliefs or they don't believe in the Quran correctly or something like that. You have an obligation, if you're there, that say, you know what, I cannot pray behind you because I don't consider you to be a Muslim because of this and this belief. Yeah, you tell the person openly. I mean, it depends if they're your friend or something like that. Why are you in that place in the first place, right? So it depends really on a case-by-case basis. Why are you there in the first place? Like, are you in their mosque or someone's home? Okay, so you're in their home and it's time to pray or something like that. Try and put yourself forward to pray and then just be quiet about it. If you can't and they insist on leading the prayer, then you say, you know what, the other people who would care enough, some people may not care, the ones who would care, you have an obligation to let them know. The rock, yeah, it's a piece of rock. Yeah, because they believe that you're supposed to be prostrating on open ground. On the earth. That's an offshoot. That's something that came up later. So people kind of added that part. So there's a general belief that you're supposed to pray on the open ground. So if you're praying on the ground, you don't need the rock. You only need the rock when you're praying on a carpet or something like that. So anyway, so there's a lot of things. So to further on your question, so the thing is, so if you have somebody like let's say from 5%, 5%ers. This is another group that's very popular nowadays. A lot of rappers are becoming 5%er Muslims. Right? So 5%ers have this interesting theory that 5% of the world controls like 85% of the minds of the people in the world, and the other 10% are like, the ones who are kind of have an understanding of what's going on or whatever it is. So they believe that everyone is God. That's what they believe. Every single human being is some type of God, and that's their philosophy. They built it up, but it's somehow associated with Islam. Now from that perspective, if somebody believes that and says, okay, I'm going to lead you in prayer. As a Muslim, you're not supposed to be praying behind them because there's nothing to do with Islam. Right? If somebody believes in another prophet and then they're leading you in prayer, you don't consider them to be full Muslim. So it's not something that you should shy away from or something like that unless it's going to cause a major problem. But when there's a doubt about someone, you say, well, maybe they could believe this, maybe they could believe that. You have the best opinion about them and you say that, you know what, let's assume that they're Muslim. Her obligation is to whisper it to you, that's right, to let you know that, you know what, we shouldn't pray behind this person. Right? But if you're going to her house, right, and she knows that, you're going to this person's house, then you're not sure if they're going to pray or they're not going to pray, you're stopping by for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, she doesn't have an obligation to tell you. That's not sufficient for somebody to not consider them Muslim anymore, just because they don't believe in some ahadith which are in Sahih Bukhari. I know. So it's not a good thing, it's not a nice thing that he did, but that in and of itself is not sufficient. And we're going to learn more about that in the hadith class. Like Imam Daraqutni criticize hadith in Sahih Bukhari. That doesn't mean that he wasn't one of the greatest imams, Yeah, so this is not right, you shouldn't be criticizing companions and the wives of the Prophet and this and that. But just that aspect is not enough to label someone as a disbeliever. That's right. So remember we talked about who you're allowed to pray behind? What did we say? Who are we allowed to pray behind? Who are we not allowed to pray behind? So if you're certain he's a disbeliever, what if it's a person who's drinking and a major sinner? And he just left his girlfriend in the car and he came. And all of a sudden somebody put him up front to go lead. And now you came late to the masjid and you just saw his girlfriend in the car, right? And you saw his can of beer on top of his car, right? And you come in and you're 1 rak'ah late. Are you going to join the prayer or are you going to go pray your own prayer? You're going to join the prayer because he's still a Muslim, right? Muslim who needs a little shaking up. yeah. So the Progressive Muslim Union. So this is an interesting group. So what do we say about them? I mean, we can't go into details about modern groups and all that, but are they still generally considered to be Muslim? Yes. Or do they have some very interesting and strange beliefs? Yes. So we need to, be cautious about their beliefs, but at the same time, there's nothing that I know of that takes them out of Islam. Clearly out of Islam. Because they believe in the Quran, they believe in the Sunnah, they believe in, they believe in most of the things. They have some very weird ideas and they have a very strange blog. I don't even want to mention what it is. But they're still Muslim in the end of the day, as far as I know. They read the translation. Yeah. So when they're praying like that, you don't pray behind them. But let's say they're praying Zohar prayer, right? They're silent. Just assume you don't know who it is. Assume that they're hopefully praying correctly. Right? So like the imam who's leading the prayer, let's say for Zohar prayer, you don't know if he's like singing a song during the prayer, right? But you assume the best about him. He could be singing a Beatles song during the prayer. You don't know, but you're focusing on your prayer. Right? So you kind of assume the best about, unless you know for sure. If you know for sure this person does not even read Quran during his prayer, for example, then yeah, you should not be praying mine. Yeah, so during that prayer, you shouldn't join them. Outside of that prayer, let's say there's someone else who goes and attends that place. You can't be certain that that person is going to be doing the exact same thing because the movement is not established yet. It's still developing. And it's kind of here and there, and mostly they have a website. They don't even have, they were looking for a place to lead, prayer when, Amina Wudu was going to give the khutbah. There wasn't a single masjid that would even allow them to, lead that prayer. So they prayed in a church, which means that they don't have a following. They don't actually have legitimacy and following. So that's what happens. All these small groups, most of them don't really have a following. So like the gay imam in Paris, right? He performs the marriages for the gay Muslim couples in a church or a Buddhist prayer room because there's no masjid that's going to allow him to do that. So sometimes the media like shows them to be really big, but they're actually like a tiny little group of people. Like the Terry Jones and burning the Quran guy. You know how many people he had? You know how many people he had in his whole congregation? 90 people. That means that Imam Uthman's Sunday school is more than double the size of his whole congregation. Right? And he's making media headlines and CNN and this and that. He's got 85 to 90 people, all his followers combined. That's not the people who show up to church every Sunday. That's just all his followers, whoever attend that church. So we should be careful about how big we make these, people out to be. So, okay, Islamically, you're not supposed to beat yourself. You're not supposed to hit yourself with a sword or with a chain or anything like that. That's a type of mourning that we're not supposed to be doing. It's inflicting harm to the body and all of that. But from the belief perspective, that also doesn't render you outside of the fold of Islam. But it's like drinking. Drinking does not take you out of Islam, but you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Yeah, it's better to not be a part of those gatherings. If you know these things are going to happen, it's better to not be a part of the gathering and just politely decline. So you politely decline and say, no, I cannot attend this because I don't accept this as being correct. It's like somebody, invites you to idol worshipping ceremony and you don't agree with it. You say, well, let me just go and watch. Don't go and watch. Just go and do something beneficial, study for your CIS test, and do better on the test, inshallah. That's only the non-CIS community. You see? So now the CIS community is going to know better, and they can inform the non-CIS community so that this changes, inshallah. Okay? Last question. Ahmadiyya, yes. It's a modern group. So a guy by the name of Ghulam Ahmad, who lived in Qadian in India, he claimed to be a prophet, and he claimed to be the Mahdi and the prophet. So he started his own group, and there's two splits of this group. There's what is known as the Qadianis, and there's what's known as the Lahori Ahmadiyya. Small group within them. So the Qadianis believe that he's a prophet, and the Lahori Ahmadis, they say that he is not a prophet, but he meant when he called him himself a prophet, he said it metaphorically, right? Which you're not supposed to be doing anyways, right? But from that perspective, there is some flexibility in saying that this small group of people, the Lahori Ahmadiyya, that they're still within the folds of Islam. Anyone else who says that there's another prophet after the Prophet ﷺ is outside the fold of Islam. You need to find out. Yeah, I know that masjid in Pomona. I've called them once. I didn't get to. They wouldn't answer me. I talked to the secretary, and they wouldn't give me a clear answer. So you need to figure out if that is the Lahori one or it's the actual Qadi. And the vast majority are the Qadiani ones. The Lahori group is a very, very small group. So it's very unlikely that they are. So it's probably better not to go there. Okay. That's the one he's talking about. Yeah, that's the one he's talking about. So, khair, inshallah. Yeah, they're very well versed in, their own teachings, and they believe that the word, Khatimun Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets, or that the prophet was the last of the prophets, they don't believe in that. They believe that that word actually meant the word ring, because the prophet wore a ring. So the Quran is talking about the prophet's ring. That's a very weak argument, but that's what they say. And if you don't know your Arabic, or you don't know your principles of interpretation, or you don't know anything, you can easily buy into that argument. And you say, oh, I didn't realize that, and there's a new prophet. Okay, great. So you need to be careful about that, and you need to have your basics down. Okay. So let's stop there. It's past 10 o'clock now. It's been a long day for everyone. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nastaghfirukallah wa natubu ilayk. And remember, this is the last class. So next Thursday, where will I see you? At home studying, right? Not doing something else, studying for the final exam. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.